But it's very odd for an architect to conceive of a project knowing prior to its conception the day it's going to be bulldozed. Beirut taught me a lot. The sourness of Beirut, the complexity of Beirut, and the strategies you need to elaborate to survive and produce meaning in this environment is very, very different than practicing in more stable grounds. The first project ever built, it was that nightclub we built in 98.
B018. But locals, we just call it BO. So we're driving and we get to what looks like a vacant parking lot. And they go, "We're here." And I go, "We are where?" "There is nightclub." I go, "No, there is empty parking lot."
We're in the late 90s. Beirut is being portrayed as, this very sugar-coated story again of the phoenix coming out of its ashes, east meets west. That's the story that's circulating. Even back then, I understand that there's something wrong.
You know, you were saying your dad hated being called a brutalist. What do you hate to be called?
The criticism becomes very, very harsh when the structures become bigger and more visible.
Do you feel aesthetically there is a Bernard Khoury look?
I wouldn't like to be recognized through gestures. Don't call me cynical.
Welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mike Imhanna. We're recording live on location at the architectural studio of Bernard Khoury here in Beirut. Welcome, Bernard. Thanks.
Welcome to you.
I should say thanks for having us, but more than welcome.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah. The first thing I said to you upon entering this space immediately was like, oof, this place must have been affected like crazy after the blast. We're sitting here in Karantina, like a few minutes away from Marfat, Beirut.
Yeah, we're a few hundred meters away from the port of Beirut. So yeah, the office was totally destroyed on August 4th, 2020. We were about 20 people in here. Stitches and cuts here and there, but luckily everybody was fine.
Yeah.
A few weeks later.
How long have you been?
3 weeks later, the office was
back up and running.
Back up and running, yeah.
How long have you been in Karantina? How long has this space actually been here?
I moved to the studio just over 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So there was nobody here back then.
It's funny, like that decision, that type of decision is it's not like, I can't imagine that you were just going with some real estate agent looking around. This was a random choice. It seems like a very intentional choice. And no, I want to be in this neighborhood. I want to have this be a production hub.
Well, my story with Karantina goes back a little further.
Yeah.
The first project ever built is just a couple of hundred meters away from here. And it was that nightclub we built in 98, back when it wasn't very reasonable to start a nightclub or an entertainment destination in this area, in this neighborhood.
That's BO.
Yeah, that was BO. First project I ever built.
I had no idea that's the first project you ever built.
Yeah.
In the world?
Yeah. My beginnings go back to 93, and but that's a long story. The whole supposedly post-war era, and the illusions and disillusions that came with that. The naive young kid I was, obviously coming in with certain expectations and certain ideas about reconstruction back then, and during those 5 years, understanding that the war wasn't really over. The reconstruction, as I thought would happen, never really happened. There was a lot of construction happening, but it took me time to understand that it was difficult to put the war in between brackets. In fact, it had not started on April 13, 1975, and didn't end with the Taif Accords. We were just putting things under the carpet during that so-called post-war period. Back then, in 93, if you had told me that I'd be building nightclubs and restaurants, I don't think I would have made it back to Beirut. It wouldn't have been a glorious, comeback or a noble, architectural.
Yeah. Although maybe in retrospect, it is the most noble.
But I was Beirut back then, so I think the only sector that trusted me was the entertainment industry, the nightlife, temporary projects, which took us to the quarantine, the Karantina.
Yeah.
Initially for strategic reasons, because real estate was very cheap. We were renting, we couldn't afford to buy, so we put our hand on an important piece of property that we could take for a very short period of time, initially 5 years.
Yeah.
So we had, again, a project with an expiry date of 5 years, which is very odd for an architect. When you think of the Architectural Act, you think of permanence.
Yeah.
That's how we're trained, that's our culture. But it's very odd for an architect to conceive of a project knowing prior to its conception the day it's going to be bulldozed. It goes against the nature of the practice.
It's kind of freeing, though.
Well, I realized that later. But, so that was my first step in the quarantine. Was that club. Strategic because it's very close to the center, yet very affordable. In 3 minutes, you're literally in the so-called city center. It's at the intersection of the north, south, and east-west main arteries of the country. So you can come in and out. It's very geographically very strategic. Yet, strangely, this area did not develop. If you look at a map of Beirut, or you look at an aerial photo of Beirut, the quarantine is like a black hole. Strangely, the city sprawled northbound, but bypassed the quarantine. Well, there are reasons for that. And they're mainly political, but there's also a very macabre aura around the quarantine due to its sad past. Not just the quarantine period, but the Armenian refugee camp, which didn't last very long, 1915, but very soon the Armenians left and went to Burj Hamoud and Marum Khalil. But then Arab al-Maslakh, Lebanese from the south, Palestinians in 48 and on, up until January, February of 1976, with the infamous quarantine battle or massacre, whatever you want to call it. And after that, nothing really happens. And you look at the quarantine in the late 90s when we were searching for a site, there was no one here except the garbage processing company, the tanneries, and the maslach,
like the slaughterhouse.
The slaughterhouse, yeah. So that was the club in 98, and then a few years later, had to move from the factory where my office, the family furniture factory where I was based initially, which is outside of Beirut. I moved to Beirut, and I needed a big space, very affordable. It still is at this point, relative to its surface, and very strategic. So when I came here, there was no one except the printing press, which is still located under
on the ground floor.
André Sfer followed me a few months later while visiting Beirut, saw the space and thought it would make a great gallery, and started the gallery upstairs, which has become a very important gallery in the region and even beyond. Just celebrated her 20th birthday a few days back.
Do you recognize the Bernard who came back in the 90s? Do you think your relationship to the city or to your profession is similar to the relationship he had to the city or the profession?
Well, it's a tough question. Obviously, there are some roots and ideas that remain, but I think Beirut taught me a lot.
Yeah.
The sourness of Beirut, the complexity of Beirut, and the strategies you need to elaborate to survive and produce meaning in this environment is very, very different than practicing in more stable grounds. So it grew on me, for the better or the worse. But I think practicing in Beirut was obviously led me to a very, very different career and even production altogether than if I had stayed in the US or Europe back then, which was an important choice to make in the early 90s. But I couldn't predict, or what I predicted was obviously very, very different at the outset than the journey ended up going through.
Did you come back with optimism? Was that the driving emotion? Or a sense of duty or guilt? ما بعرف.
Well, I came back with a lot of excitement and a lot of questions and interrogations. Well, it's a long story, but there was a lot of disillusion in the college years. Disillusions with the practice, with architecture and urbanism in general, the failures of our practice at the time, the fact that it was a practice that was no longer producing meaning as it used to. I would say prior to the industrial age, and I think the mechanical age, as Virilio calls it, brought with it other forms of producing meaning, and Virilio said it has to do with speed. So we move with the Industrial Revolution, the machine age, at another speed, and I think architecture, deeply rooted in matter, and stone, and and permanence, did not really survive that, or lost grounds. Prior to that, prior to the industrial age or the Industrial Revolution, architecture was a very important practice, was a very important, was a major art. The early moderns thought that they were part of the game. And it took them some time until, I'd say, the mid-20th century, the 60s, to understand that we had lost our role. My time in college, at college in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, was the brink of the beginning of another more important revolution, which was the electronic revolution. We're going further, much faster, at a much faster speed. We're talking about dematerialization, and here the role again of architecture, our perception of space changing drastically. Now, I'm in the US at that point, not very much concerned with politics in Lebanon. I had spent already 7 years away, important formative years away from the conflict here.
Yeah.
I, if anything, was perceiving my life someplace else. So the issues I was concerned with had to do with, were much more global, had to do with architecture, the practice. That was the crisis I was confronting. Then comes something, a big reconstruction project with no precedent called Solidere. Very symbolic, with all the sugar-coated packaging that comes with it at the time. You can be critical or not. I'm not looking at it from, a very narrow political angle. But what was very interesting about Solidere, besides the fact that it was the biggest real estate venture on the planet back then.
Yeah.
We tend to forget that. It came along, it came because of the bankruptcy of the state lack of ability, state's lack of ability to rebuild that demolished city center. Anyway, we're not going to go too deep into that. But what was interesting about Solidere was the formula brought forward. Very controversial in the sense of the expropriation formula, which converted the ownership of land, of any given property, to shares.
Shares, publicly traded shares in a company,
Exactly.
Essentially. Yeah.
So you're moving from the most stable, grounded, material form of ownership to the most immaterial, volatile, abstract.
A home
form
to a piece of
ownership.
paper. Yeah.
And I'm thinking, this change of parameter is going to bring forward a new urbanism, a new way of perceiving the city, which no other city in the world has ever seen. To me, it was no longer Berlin, New York, Tokyo, these were in the Stone Age. Beirut was entering, from an urbanism point of view, was bringing along questions, extremely critical and complex, that to me, from a theoretical angle, as a young, early 20s young kid, thought were extremely interesting.
Yeah, it's like a petri dish. It's all this experimentation.
So and some of my experimental work at grad school had to do with that. I had already produced a number of projects, very theoretical back then, in my academic cocoon, that were dealing with these issues, beginning to tackle Beirut from that angle. Obviously, this brings with it a lot of political questions, a lot of that can, take us someplace else. But from an architect's point of view, from a young, naive architect in his academic cocoon, this was a perspective of Beirut in the early 90s, and probably one of the main reasons why I came back.
Yeah. So
obviously, things didn't go that way.
Yeah, spoiler. I want to talk about BO for a second, because for people who are not familiar with Beirut who are watching this, it's hard to overstate, it's hard to explain the cultural significance of a nightclub like BO in 1998. Why did this place matter? Or maybe you don't think it matters as much as maybe some people do.
Well, again, we're in the late 90s.
Yeah.
Beirut is being portrayed as, this very sugar-coated story again of the phoenix coming out of its ashes, east meets west, the reconciliation city that Solidere is brought forward as a very symbolic project. And that's the story that's circulating. Even back then, I understand that there's something wrong. Things are
it's
far more
glossy.
complex than that.
It's glossy. It's airbrushed, neo-capitalist,
amnesia,
yeah,
and so on. We end up here for strategic reasons.
Yeah.
Cost, geography, and so on. Sound, we could make a lot of noise. There was no one around. Around this black hole, which is the quarantine. And then we end up on this plot, which is literally at the edge of the quarantine. And I had studied the area throughout its history up until 76. And it turns out that this particular plot was one of the densest points of areas of the camp, where literally the shacks were sometimes a meter away, one from the other. There were no streets. Obviously, it was all wiped out.
It's a parking lot basically now.
Well, it was a parking lot, and I had done a very serious research about even its topography. It used to be up until 76, 3 meters lower.
Oh.
And during the war years, it ended up being a dump for construction sites that were basically dumping their excavations in it. Brought the level up about 3 meters to reach the level of the highway. It was confirmed to me when I started digging. But so you find yourself on a site which has a very macabre history, and you're supposed to build a nightclub on it. There's something, if anything, almost immoral at the outset, very problematic, very impossible. What do you do? And this is Beirut, and pretty much every single site I've approached since then has been explosive. Once you start scratching a little bit below the surface, it can be a very explosive city. So the quarantine was right there. The problems were very, very visible from an aerial photograph all the way to digging into the 3 meters of soil, and reaching the hard soil, which was there in 76. And this brought with it the Invisible Project, basically stressing on the void, the absence of building, which you can see very clearly from some photos that are taken from behind it, from the Sleep Comfort building, where you see this void, this absurd void, and the extreme density on the other side of the highway, which doesn't make sense because the B018 site is on the littoral side of the highway, which is supposed to be developed first before the inland part. So you clearly see that there's something wrong. There's a very obvious scar in the city fabric. And this was the beginning of our project.
So I want to talk a little bit about, before we get into where we are today, Can you explain to somebody who doesn't know anything about architecture what the connection is between building furniture and building buildings?
Well, a piece of furniture can be far more complex than a building sometimes. The seat the chair you're sitting on is probably over 50 years old.
You're kidding
my
me.
dad's production, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I come from a family of furniture builders. My grandfather was a carpenter. So I lived very close to that, and as a kid would spend sometimes, some of my holidays and free time at the factory, which was my favorite playground. It was a very interesting space with great carpenters and artisans and great machines that were developed locally. A very interesting building that was built around their manufacturing techniques. Very beautiful and sad story that ended up going bankrupt after the war.
It's so many. It's sad to hear those stories. There's so many of those stories of how these multi-generational family businesses collapsed after 91.
My father's operation came out of the war with no debt and had managed to survive the 15 years of conflict through exporting and exploring foreign markets and so on. It took about 5 to 6 years to completely destroy the whole operation, which had started in the 60s.
Wow.
So 30 years of great achievements went down the drain in a matter of 5 to 6 years due to the I think the political choices or the economical choices that were taken post-war, favoring services rather than productive sectors. So it took just a few years to completely to go bankrupt. When I came back to Beirut, I established my tiny little operation there. I was backed by the family factory for a few years until it vanished. But I was based in the factory initially.
There's a building, I think I told you this last time I saw you. I used to work in an office in Awal Hamra, Dem Sleep Comfort. That is a building your dad designed.
That was the showroom.
I don't think that was it. The first one, when you're going up the Tala'a that turns into Hamra on the left, right after Tinol, right after where Harley Davidson used to be. The building.
Oh, that's the Khouri building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that building also is like fascinating because...
Unfortunately, it was badly finished and additions were made to it later on. But you can recognize, if you have a good eye, that the skeleton is quite interesting.
So what would you say is the DNA of his architectural philosophy? Like, as you said, if you have a good eye, how could somebody with a good eye look at that and say, that's a Khalil Khouri building?
Well, it was a different time, obviously. Yeah. And my father is part of a generation that had certainties.
Had certainties?
At least they pretended to have certainties, political certainties. And certainly my father was not into trends at all. So it was a project. He was not a modernist. He was a modern in the true sense of the term. So hated labels. He didn't like the term brutalist.
Although it's applied to him.
Well, it's applied to him now, but he didn't like to hear it. Modernity was a project. Modernism, and I think its bankruptcy and its failure, comes also from the fact that it became a trend. And it's very sad to see that some of these, if even you look locally in Lebanon, the early moderns who did great works and were celebrated much later.
Like who?
I'm not going to give names.
Okay.
A lot of them who did incredibly beautiful work.
Yeah.
Great modernist specimens.
Okay.
In the 60s, even in the 50s, but in the 60s and 70s, you look at what they've done after it was no longer trendy to do that, beyond the late 80s or 90s and beyond. For those who continued, you see what they produced after, which is in complete contradiction to what was supposedly produced or whatever the ideals were behind the productions initially. They were not modern. They were modernists. They wore short skirts when it was trendy to do that, but
okay, so they were following the trend. They didn't philosophically believe in the actual
it
tenets
wasn't my
of it.
father's case at all.
Yeah.
And I have photos of my dad's childhood with Grégoire Seroff, probably at some point in the early 40s. The kids, by looking at the photos, were probably 12, 13 years old, flying glider planes they built in my grandfather's wood shop with leftovers of wood in the wood shop. Planes that flew, built out of wood. So there was a real passion for the progress that can come with the technological progress and the aeronautical industry and so on. He was like that. Now, politically very difficult to frame, because starts as a young leftist and has credible anecdotes and stories with that. But at the same time is a poker player and industrialist and becomes a partner in real estate ventures. And at the end of his career, doesn't take on any clients anymore, because he either builds for friends or projects in which he is personally involved, which is very odd for an architect.
Yeah.
Deontologically strange. While in the beginning of his life, worked mainly on public projects. And I think through his career, you can read very interestingly the rise and fall of the modern project, but also the rise and fall of the nation project. Because by the mid-70s, the complete absence of the state, and then a drastic change even in his practice.
When you were a kid, was he a patriot? Did he love the idea of the nation and the idea of the state?
I think when I was a kid, or when I was old enough to understand, he had probably there was a great disillusion for the idea of the state here.
Yeah.
And our failure in the building of a nation state, and he was very aware of that. Even in the 90s, there was great disillusion. In fact, post-Taif, I think there was still some sort of belief throughout the war years, maybe a survival force, and an incredible deception after Taif.
Yeah. So thinking about the philosophical DNA of his work, how is that different to the philosophical DNA of your practice?
Well, again, you're looking at someone who, starts his career in the late 50s, early 60s, in a political context that's very different than the one I experienced in my beginnings. Illusions of a nation state, institutional projects. He built schools, churches, and so on, although he was not a Christian in the real sense of the term. But most of his interesting works, or his important commissions, up until the 70s, I would say there's a good 10 years of important, large-scale public projects. And this was the Fuad Shah period and so on. I start my career in the late 90s in a completely different political condition.
Yeah.
So obviously the strategies are very different. Don't call me cynical, but I'm not. But obviously a very different perception of my environment. Or
you were saying your dad, if he hated being called a brutalist, right? What do you hate to be called? Like, how do people misunderstand your work in a way that makes you cringe or roll your eyes? If somebody says, somebody who's well-intentioned, you're at a dinner party and somebody says to you, "Yeah, Bernard, I love your work. It is blank." What drives you crazy?
Maybe the latest episode was just a few days back. A very respected colleague of mine that I very much respect, who's more involved in the academy than other great theorists. Very, very first in theory, and looks at me and tells me, talks about a building we completed a while back and says, I love its proportions. And the last thing I would think about this building would be its proportions. So, but you know, but I'm far more interested in sometimes the very negative comments we get,
Okay.
which if anything, build my case even stronger. Sometimes the very simplistic accusations and of some of my interventions in Beirut, and there's been a lot of that. Strangely, not necessarily in the beginning, although it was much more fertile. It was much easier to attack the bad boy who dances on grapes, because that was the label that I hated, but that was the label. There was a little bit of criticism on that front, but it remained very superficial and didn't go very far. It's interesting to see that the criticism becomes very, very harsh when the structures become bigger and more visible. So obviously in the later years, we tackle bigger projects. We work with developers, and the projects are more visible and imply much more important investments in terms of capital. At which point, you're labeled as the collaborator of the capitalists who are, the real estate investors who are butchering the city, and that's a great story, because I would love to confront any one of those and and have a conversation.
Do you feel aesthetically there is a Bernard Khoury look to the end product?
I wouldn't like to be recognized through gestures. That's the last thing I would like to be recognized for. If anything, it goes against everything I stand for. So when people tell me they recognize my building at the first sight, I start to question myself. And I would like to convince myself that they would recognize an attitude or certain strategies or certain meanings, but not necessarily a form of gesture, shapes or forms or even color. Unlike someone like Zaha Hadid, for instance, who has very obvious, recognizable syntax.
Yeah.
Or someone like Gary. I'm the anti-that. If you want to talk about references, I feel much closer to Jean Nouvel, for instance. But even beyond stylistic issues and syntax, I'll even go further and say that I'm probably one of the very few architects who will tell you very proudly that I can contradict myself from one street corner to the other simultaneously, sometimes on the same program, because I'm obsessed with specificity. And context to me is not the Arab world. Context to me, or any definition that can be tagged along that, context to me is not Lebanon, is not Beirut, is not even a neighborhood. Context to me is being obsessive about the specificity of a situation at a given point in time. All players involved, that's context. And that can lead you to a radically different answer, literally across the street, sometimes simultaneously, and I've done it.
Yeah.
And a very different posture, and even a very different meaning, without being cynical at all. And this is when you might have a chance at being contextual. And the minute you try to be contextual in a very general sense of the term, you end up producing consensual definitions, watered down definitions, common denominators that basically are dangerously simplistic and dismiss anything that does not fall into the common denominator or the consensus. I'm at war with that. Don't ask me to define my city in any consensual terms. I'm not interested. I've given up on that. I'm absolutely convinced that whatever I've done over the last 30 years in my city and even in other territories are extremely deeply rooted in the territory and are hopefully contributing to producing something. Sometimes not very sugar-coated, sometimes sour, but at the end of the day, there's an honesty and still some sort of optimism in producing meaning that is specific, that comes out of a very specific situation, that's being contextual, that is being political, that is contributing, hopefully, to the construction of a history that that is a bit more complex and makes more sense, and is more relevant than the dangerous, toxic simplifications that we're being fed. Okay, now I can be perceived by some as the last candidate to represent the Lebanese or the Arab architect, but I tell them "F you," because I'm not succumbing or surrendering to your definition of what I'm supposed to be. I'm far more complex than that.
Yeah. Do you feel like your relationship to the region or to the place or all these places has soured over time since the 90s? Do you like? Let me.
Don't say sour in a negative way. When I use the term sour, I can take pleasure out of
a pickle, a kabis is sour.
Yeah,
it might sour in a yogurt is sour.
Sure.
Lemonade is sour. I guess this is what I mean. I'll give you an example. Sometimes when I never open TikTok, but sometimes I click the button because afikra has a TikTok. Mm-hmm. And if you know anything about the app, it's hyper local. So like you click it and you're just bombarded, at least for me, all this local content, ridiculous content.
Yeah.
And it makes me spiral down this deep spiral of feeling completely estranged from this place that I choose to make my home. Huge estrangement. Yeah. And I actively choose Beirut to be my home.
Yeah.
I moved back as a fully formed adult. I'm running a business here. But that level of estrangement to me is...
But this applies to Berlin, this applies to London, this applies to Tokyo,
Sure.
This applies to... Well, I think we are less immune maybe because our inability to formulate our own history sometimes.
Yeah.
So coming back to questions of identity.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask you questions about Beirut specifically. As somebody who thinks about the contexts, right? Are there specific corners or buildings or moments that you're like, oh, it's like my white whale. Like, I wish I could go back and do that project, that building. I wish I could do something on that corner.
I don't know if I can pick any sort of idealized situation or dream situation. I would have given you a quick answer maybe 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But I tell you that today, looking back at, we have probably over 400 attempts in our archives. When I say attempts, meaning from concept stage to sometimes completion, with a successful rate. It's funny, I didn't count exactly.
Sure.
But at the beginning, it was under 10%. At the beginning, it was 0 out of the first 16. But no, the first year was probably...
The 17th one
yeah.
you got there.
Yeah. I would say the first few years, but probably 1 out of 10 would get built.
Yeah.
And every time you're absolutely, there's an incredible, the very intense relationship to the situation and in illusions and so on. And then you abort. Okay, so we've had a lot of those. Around 400 today. A portion of which was built, small portion. But looking back, I think the most interesting ones were not necessarily the most interesting ones at the outset, at the beginning. So, and sometimes what seemed to be the most impossible or the most difficult at the beginning turns out to be the most interesting experience.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know how to answer you seriously about that, except, give me a tough, I'm like a rat. You need to put me in a corner, and the more difficult the situation is, I think the more interesting the experience is going to be. The easier it is at the outset,
Yeah.
the less interesting the result would be.
Last question before we go. For 30 years, for 30 summers, since you've come back, I'm sure you've met people, Lebanese who are coming back here for the summer, saying, "Lebanon أحلى بلد بالعالم." Have your feelings towards that type of sentence changed, come in over time?
It's a very intense environment that I got addicted to. Not smooth, not sweet at all, not comfortable. Drains the shit out of you. But you're always aggressed by existential questions that don't let you go to sleep. And it's grown on me, and I like that.
Do you ever get surprised when people are like allured by certain generations of architectural buildings or buildings around? I mean, when people say, "Oh, Jamaiz is the most beautiful neighborhood," or I love these old buildings from the late 1890s from this area. I love Fakhreddin. I love Beit Din. I love these types of things. Are you ever like turned off?
I love them too. I don't mean to discredit or disregard any periods in history, and that was my criticism for Solidere at some point that, came up many times through interviews and at some point bothered some people. When I said, when I made fun of the motto at some point that Solidere had on all its brochures and its commercial brochures, it was even stamped in some of the concrete blocks they would put around construction sites. Beirut مدينة عريقة للمستقبل. It's very interesting. عريقة للمستقبل, deeply rooted for the future. So it talks about past roots and it talks about the future. The past is interesting because it recognizes all the conquerors, or every single civilization that has conquered the territory. 6 layers, in fact, in the so-called city center, 6 archaeological layers. And all of them are recognized and celebrated, and great. And I do recognize that, and I think it's a very positive thing. We've even seen and we've revealed and unveiled things we had not seen before.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic. And it stops, we go all the way through the Ottoman period, and it stops with the French Mandate. History stops prior to the independence, prior to 1943. Beyond 1943, you're not part of history. Strange. So there's basically the history of the Republic or the nation state is not in history. It's not considered historical. That's very strange.
Yeah.
It's very dangerous. And then the future, obviously. The future is this promised modernity that you're going to import. It's basically a list of consultants, none of them being Arabs. I look at it with a lot of cautious and So that's the future. But the present, we're not there. And this is exactly this is where, to me, this is the failure of our culture at this point. If we want to talk about a consensual grounds or the Arab world in general, this is the problem. So I'm not dismissing the archaeological layers, the Ottoman period, the colonial, the French. I'm not. Obviously, it is part. They're all chapters, but history is always in the making. And you should, at some point, contribute to the reading of what's behind you, but
Yeah.
also to formulating your existence in the present. If you're not able to do that, you're bound for failure,
Yeah.
catastrophes.
Bernard, thanks so much. This was fantastic. I
Okay.
appreciate that.